NewsRadio leans heavily into the theme of competition and insecurity within the WNYX team, building its narrative around a situation that begins as a relatively harmless comparison, but quickly spirals into a full-blown internal rivalry that exposes the fragile egos and hidden ambitions of nearly everyone in the office. And it all starts when the station becomes aware of a competing radio network or a rival program that is gaining traction, receiving praise, or outperforming WNYX in key areas such as ratings, audience engagement, or critical recognition. And this external benchmark immediately disrupts the team's sense of stability because while they are used to chaos within their own environment, being measured against an outside standard introduces a different kind of pressure, one that feels more personal and harder to dismiss. And Dave Nelson, as the station manager, takes this development particularly seriously, interpreting it as a reflection of his leadership and feeling compelled to respond in a way that proves WNYX can compete at a higher level, which leads him to initiate a series of changes and challenges aimed at boosting performance. Though his approach is often reactive and slightly overzealous, reflecting his tendency to equate control with competence. While Lisa Miller initially supports the idea of rising to the challenge, seeing it as an opportunity for growth and improvement, but quickly becomes frustrated when the competitive mindset begins to overshadow collaboration and mutual support, creating tension not only with Dave, but also with the rest of the team as they become increasingly focused on individual recognition rather than collective success. And Bill McNeil reacts to the situation by doubling down on his need for validation, viewing the rival station's success as a direct threat to his own status and responding with exaggerated efforts to prove his superiority, which manifest in over-the-top broadcasts, self-promotional behavior, and a general air of desperation that undermines his credibility even as it generates comedic moments. While Joe Garelli takes a more cynical and detached view, questioning the very premise of competition and arguing that comparing creative output in such a quantitative way is inherently flawed, though his resistance does not prevent him from engaging in the rivalry on his own terms, often through subtle acts of defiance or unconventional strategies that challenge the notion of what winning actually means. And Matthew, as usual, becomes caught in the crossfire, attempting to align himself with whichever approach seems most likely to earn approval, resulting in a series of misguided efforts to outperform his own colleagues, which only serve to highlight his insecurity and lack of direction. While Catherine Duke navigates the situation with a strategic mindset, recognizing that competition can be both a motivator and a distraction, and using it to her advantage by positioning herself as both competent and composed amid the chaos, often stepping into roles or tasks that others neglect in their pursuit of recognition, thereby increasing her own value within the team. And as the episode progresses, the competitive dynamic intensifies, leading to a breakdown in communication and cooperation, as team members begin to prioritize personal achievements over shared goals, resulting in overlapping efforts, conflicting strategies, and a general sense of fragmentation that undermines the station's overall effectiveness. And Dave, in his attempt to manage this growing tension, inadvertently exacerbates it by introducing metrics, rankings, or performance evaluations that pit the team against each other more directly, believing that this will drive improvement, but failing to anticipate the negative impact on morale and cohesion. And Lisa becomes increasingly vocal in her opposition to this approach, arguing that the station's strength lies in its collaborative dynamic and that turning everything into a competition risks destroying the very qualities that make it unique, leading to a series of confrontations between her and Dave that highlight their differing philosophies on leadership and success. And Bill's behavior becomes more erratic as he chases validation. Joe's resistance becomes more pointed. Matthew's confusion deepens, and Catherine continues to operate with calculated efficiency, all of which contribute to a sense that the station is losing its identity in the pursuit of external approval. And the turning point of the episode comes when the consequences of this internal rivalry become impossible to ignore, whether through a failed broadcast, a missed opportunity, or a moment of collective dysfunction that clearly demonstrates the cost of prioritizing competition over collaboration, forcing Dave to confront the reality that his approach, while well-intentioned, has led the team away from what actually makes them effective. And this realization prompts a shift in perspective, as he begins to understand that success cannot be defined solely by comparison to others, but must also take into account the internal dynamics and values that sustain the team, leading him to reconsider his strategy and move toward a more balanced approach that emphasizes both improvement and cohesion. And Lisa plays a key role in this transition, helping to reestablish a sense of shared purpose and encouraging the team to refocus on their collective strengths. While Joe's skepticism is partially validated, Bill gradually returns to a more grounded version of himself. Matthew finds some stability as expectations become clearer, and Catherine continues to provide insight and direction where needed. And as the episode moves toward its conclusion, the competitive tension begins to dissipate, replaced by a renewed emphasis on teamwork and mutual support, though not without lingering traces of ambition and ego that continue to shape the characters' interactions. And the final moments reinforce the idea that while competition can serve as a catalyst for growth, it must be balanced with an understanding of what truly defines success, suggesting that for WNYX, that success lies not in outperforming others, but in maintaining the unique, chaotic, and collaborative environment that allows its team to function at their best, resulting in an ending that restores the familiar dynamic while also highlighting the lessons learned, as Dave leads with greater awareness, Lisa with renewed conviction, Joe with quiet affirmation, Bill with tempered ego, Matthew with cautious confidence, and Catherine with her characteristic clarity, all of them moving forward with a slightly deeper understanding of how to navigate the tension between individual ambition and collective identity. And the episode ultimately stands as a commentary on the complexities of competition in creative environments, using humor and character-driven storytelling to explore how easily the pursuit of external validation can disrupt internal balance, and how important it is to recognize and preserve the elements that make a team truly effective. The episode unfolds as a sharp, emotionally layered continuation of the station's attempt to move forward while still carrying the invisible weight of everything that has changed around them. And it begins with WNYX buzzing over a minor technical glitch that Dave Nelson insists is symbolic of a deeper systemic failure, which of course no one else takes seriously except Bill, who immediately interprets it as a sign of corporate sabotage, government surveillance, or possibly an alien probe targeting AM frequencies. And from that jumping-off point, the story branches into multiple overlapping threads that gradually braid together into a chaotic but strangely heartfelt crescendo. Dave, determined to prove he is still a competent station manager despite constant undermining by both corporate and his own staff, decides to conduct a full operational audit of everyone's responsibilities, which instantly triggers paranoia across the newsroom because nobody is entirely sure what they actually do on a daily basis beyond vague creative chaos. Lisa sees the audit as an opportunity to formalize her authority and subtly angle for greater managerial recognition. Joe treats it like a personal attack on his technical genius and begins over-engineering solutions to problems that do not exist. Catherine responds with existential dread that her on-air persona might be categorized as non-essential, and Matthew spirals into a full-blown anxiety episode because he realizes he has been coasting on charm and obedience without any clearly defined skill set, while Jimmy James, operating from his own surreal orbit of wealth and philosophical detachment, becomes fascinated by the concept of job definitions and starts questioning whether any human role has inherent meaning in late capitalism, a line of thinking that both terrifies and delights him. As Dave moves through the station clipboard in hand, attempting to observe productivity, each encounter reveals more about the characters than about the workflow itself, because the real tension is not about efficiency, but about identity. And the comedy grows from the contrast between Dave's bureaucratic language and the deeply personal insecurities bubbling underneath it, particularly when he asks Bill to describe his contribution to the station, and Bill launches into a grand monologue about journalistic integrity that slowly devolves into rambling self-mythologizing tales of foreign correspondence, secret informants, and moral crusades that likely never happened. Yet in that exaggerated storytelling, there is a flicker of truth about how much Bill clings to the idea of himself as a serious journalist in a workplace that often treats news as background noise for punchlines. Meanwhile, Lisa quietly starts conducting her own parallel evaluation process, subtly testing whether she could run the station more smoothly than Dave by delegating small tasks and observing reactions. And the experiment briefly works because she has a cooler demeanor and less visible panic, but cracks form when she realizes that authority at WNYX depends less on logic and more on surviving absurdity, something Dave, for all his neuroses, has learned the hard way, and this realization humbles her just enough to soften her competitive edge. Joe's subplot escalates when he installs an elaborate monitoring system to help Dave gather data, which accidentally reroutes several feeds and causes dead air during a live segment, triggering Catherine to improvise wildly on air with a stream of consciousness monologue about the fragility of modern communication that listeners interpret as avant-garde performance art, and the station receives unexpected praise, forcing Dave to confront the uncomfortable truth that chaos sometimes generates better results than control. Matthew's arc is perhaps the most emotionally resonant, as he desperately tries to demonstrate value by volunteering for increasingly humiliating tasks, including fetching obscure equipment, reorganizing outdated files, and even offering to take blame for the technical failure. But when Dave finally sits him down and asks what he actually wants from his job, Matthew confesses that he just wants to feel needed. A simple admission that briefly cuts through the comedic rhythm and grounds the episode in sincerity before Bill barges in to argue that need is a social construct invented by management to suppress artistic freedom. Jimmy, having spent the episode oscillating between philosophical musings and random interference, ultimately decides that the audit itself is the problem because it imposes artificial metrics on something inherently organic. And in a grand flourish, he announces that WNYX will instead adopt a creative entropy model, which means everyone keeps their job exactly as it is with no clarified responsibilities whatsoever. A decision that simultaneously relieves and frustrates Dave because it validates his team's quirks while rendering his entire day of effort meaningless, and yet in that circular outcome lies the thematic core of the episode. The station functions not because roles are defined, but because personalities collide in oddly complementary ways. The climax comes when Dave, exhausted and borderline defeated, tries to present a structured report to Jimmy only to realize halfway through that nobody is listening because the staff has drifted into an impromptu debate about whether work itself is inherently absurd, and instead of fighting it, he lets the conversation flow, watching as Bill, Lisa, Joe, Catherine, and Matthew argue, joke, contradict each other, and ultimately laugh. And in that messy interaction, Dave recognizes that leadership here is less about imposing order and more about maintaining